I mentioned that a highlight for us was becoming grandparents. And recently a few days ago actually, I was in a conversation with a young dad. He's got small kids. He congratulated me on being a grandfather, and we talked a little bit about being a dad. And finally he asked me this question. It was kind of a provocative question. He said, "Okay, George," he said, "which season as a dad have you enjoyed the most?" And to be honest with you, he asked me that question, and the first thought that came to mind was this. Well, I don't know which one I enjoyed the most, but I really didn't enjoy the baby stage. That was kind of, I knew that wasn't my favorite. But as I thought a little bit more, and I just kind of paused for a moment, and it's like I was quickly kind of revisiting 30 years of experiences. As I thought about it, I finally responded this way. And I realized this may seem like a non-answer, but what I told him was, as I look back, each season has had its own sources of joy, sources of opportunity, as well as its own set of challenges and stressors. And as I reflected on that conversation, I thought, I just think that's how life works. On Friday, Rose and I received a Christmas letter from some friends of ours in Illinois, and here's how they opened their letter. Each year brings its own configuration of joys and challenges. And I think that's true for all of us. I mean, we gather today, and some of you got to spend time with multiple generations of your family. We're in different seasons of life. And hopefully right now in your life, there are opportunities for joy. There are things that are encouraging you, yet there are probably also elements of your life right now that are weighty, uncertain, and even stress-inducing. So as we prepare to enter a new year, here's my question for you. How are you going to handle the ups and the downs that this next year will bring? Look, I do not know what the next year will hold. I mean, I do know my team's not going to be in the Super Bowl, but beyond that, right, I know. I say this every year now. But I don't know exactly what this year is going to hold, but I do think for most of us, regardless of the season of life you're in, there are going to be situations that hopefully bring you joy, but there are also going to be things in this next year that create this deep sense of uncertainty, anxiety, and stress. And sometimes it may be actually the same situation. You may find all of that wrapped up together in the same situation. For instance, I mentioned a great highlight for us was becoming grandparents. And yet that came with its own stress and uncertainty because my daughter-in-law had a complicated pregnancy. Then our grandson came very early, and he ended up spending 3 weeks in the NICU unit. And so, even this one event, it was both a source of joy, but also stress and uncertainty. And I'm sure as we think about 2026, for some of you, you may already know part of what's ahead in your future. Maybe you're moving into high school or you're graduating. You're in a dating relationship and trying to figure out what's next. You're looking for a new job, or you're dealing with certain health challenges and you're trying to figure that out. You're going through some kind of change in your life, some area of your life where there is now stress, financially, relationally, dealing with your health. And so here's the question. How can we be prepared to handle these types of situations well? If we know this year is going to be filled with some ups and downs, some moments of joy, but also some things that cause uncertainty and stress, how can we deal with them well? And some of you already know what they what they are because you're dealing with them right now, and they're going to continue into the new year. Well, to answer that question, I want to go to one verse in the Psalms. It's just, for me, it's a verse I've found encouraging recently, and so I wanted to share it with you. And what I want to do this morning is really encourage you to embrace the themes of this verse as we start a new year. In fact, it might be helpful for you just to write this verse out on a card, put it in your Bible, or put it on your mirror just to remind you daily, some way that it would periodically come before your eyes and draw your attention. And the verse I'm talking about is found in Psalm 27. So I'm going to ask you, if you've got your Bibles, to join with me in turning there. And what I want to do is just take some time to walk you through this Psalm of David. And then we're going to get to the verse that I want to highlight for you. So Psalm 27. Here's how the psalm begins. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? Now notice the way this verse begins. It's sometimes referred to as a song of trust or a psalm of trust. It begins with an affirmation of who God is, the nature of his character. But notice that each line ends with a question. And notice the questions have to deal with the issue of fear, right? Whom shall I fear? Of whom shall I be afraid? Now, why would David ask those questions? Why would David include with his affirmation of God's character the theme of fear? Why do you say things like that? Well, I think you say things like that because they're competing voices in your head. You say things like that because there are things in your life that do generate fear and uncertainty and stress. And as we continue in the next verse, I think the threats that he's feeling are coming into focus. So notice the next two verses. When the wicked advance against me to devour me, it is my enemies and my foes who will stumble and fall. Though an army besiege me, my heart will not fear. Though war break out against me, even then I will be confident. Now notice what's being described here. It's a military conflict. And remember, this psalm is attributed to David. And in addition to being a shepherd and a king, he was also a soldier. And I think the backdrop to this psalm involves his experiences in conflict, in battle, and the reality of those experiences. We don't know the specific conflict that may be involved, but I think that experience of leading men into battle and all that entails provides the backdrop to this psalm. Now, given that setting, what he says next is fascinating, right? I mean, so you think about this psalm, the setting, the backdrop is the reality of war and battle, the fog of war. But then we read this. One thing I ask from the Lord, this only do I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze on the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple. As I was working through this psalm this week, a couple of things came to mind as I came to this verse. And one of them was this. It was a movie from the 1990s. I realize maybe that's before you were born. But really a movie from the 1990s called City Slickers. Some of you maybe remember this movie. It was a story about three guys from New York, and one of the characters was played by Billy Crystal. And And these three guys were kind of middle-aged, and they were three guys kind of trying to find themselves. You might say it this way. They were going through their own midlife crises. And in trying to make sense out of life, they decide to get away for 2 weeks and join a cattle drive in the West. And it's during that cattle drive that there's this iconic moment in the movie. And if you've seen the movie, you probably know the movie. The scene I'm talking about, right? I mean, it's where in the course of this conversation, this crusty old cowboy tells Billy Crystal's character, you know what the secret of life is? The secret of life is one thing. All you have to do is give your life to one thing, and nothing else matters. And that's when the other guy leans over and says, well, what's the one thing? And it's like, that you have to figure out. You remember that scene? For those in my age group, I think it was kind of this iconic moment because I think it resonated deeply with the messages in our culture that says, you know, to live well, you've got to look within. You've got to look within and find out what your life is all about and let that guide you. And then you give your life to it wholeheartedly. Well, here, remember, David is thinking from the backdrop of having been in conflict and the realities of war. And he says, yes, I want to give my life to one thing, but it's not about looking within. It's about looking without. It's about worship. Right? Instead of looking within, he's looking beyond himself. And he says, the one thing I need in these moments, God, is to be in your presence. The one thing I need is worship. And I was thinking about that and said, oh, this is where, you know, he's saying, look, in the midst of all this, the one thing I need is worship. But then it dawned on me, the imagery here seems a little out of place. Right? I mean, he talks about going to God's temple and gazing on the beauty of the Lord, and you're like, but remember the setting is military. The thing that is kind of guiding the psalm is that experience, those experiences David has had in conflict, and kind of gazing on the beauty of the Lord just kind of seems out of place. Last month, I had a friend visiting from England and who was interested in American history. So one day, I took him to Gettysburg to introduce him to the Civil War. And of course, we toured the battlefield. We went to the visitor center. We did remember the cyclorama that gives you that kind of that overarching picture of kind of the chaos and the sights, the sounds, and even the smells of that battle. And it's in the midst of something like that David says, well, what I want to do is gaze on the Lord. And you're like, how much room is there for contemplation on a battlefield? How exactly does this work? But I think what David is getting at is in the middle of these kinds of situations, these chaotic moments, he doesn't want to be overwhelmed by the chaos. He doesn't want to lose perspective. When he speaks of seeking God in his temple, I think he's saying, I want to think clearly and wisely about my circumstances. In the midst of this chaos, I want an attitude of worship to guide how I respond. And it's that mindset that then leads to what is the central statement in this psalm. Right at the heart of the psalm is this prayer. Psalm 27:7. Hear my voice when I call, Lord. Be merciful to me and answer me. Right in the midst of this chaotic season, whatever that looked like for David, he is saying, Lord, I'm appealing to your character, that you will be faithful to your character in showing me mercy. It's a cry for help. And then after bringing kind of his request to God, the theme of trust returns. And we see that toward the end of the passage in Psalm 27. So, for instance, Psalm 27:13. I will remain confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Interestingly, the underlying Hebrew of this verse is somewhat ambiguous. And there's actually an alternative way to translate this, which I think may be at work. And it's basically to say, if I had not believed that I will see the goodness of the Lord. And then the thought just breaks off. And I actually think that may have been how David was saying, right? It's like he's sought to focus his mind and his heart, even in the midst of the chaos, on the importance of worship and bringing his requests to God. And in the midst of that, he's saying, man, if I didn't have you, God, I don't know. I was thinking about this week, and I thought about multiple conversations that I've had with some of you, people in our church family, going through hard things, the loss of someone important, a medical issue, and I've heard people say something like this. George, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have God. I've heard some of you say, I don't know what I would do if I didn't have my church family and people walking through this with me. And I think in a real sense, David is kind of, if I didn't have the reality of the goodness of the Lord, I don't know what I'd do. And at this point, the thought just breaks off. And you're just kind of left to almost fill in the gaps there. I don't know where I'd be. And that's not even stated. I think it's just understood. And then we come to the last verse. And this really is the verse that I want to highlight for you and kind of leave you with. So kind of having walked through this journey of kind of focusing his mind on God, bringing his request on God, and acknowledging, I just don't know where I'd be if I didn't have you, God. We get to the end. And here's the final verse in Psalm 27. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Interestingly, the commands in this verse are in the singular. So I think in a real sense, this is David speaking to his own heart. Right? He's reminded himself of who God is and the importance of worship. He's brought his request to God and just acknowledges, I don't know where I would be without you. Now moving forward, here's the reminder that he wants to remember, and it's really a reminder he gives to each of you, right? Wait for the Lord. Be strong and take heart, and wait for the Lord. Let me just highlight two other things about this passage. First of all, that phrase, take heart. It's sometimes translated, be courageous, because maybe a more literal translation is almost take courage to your heart. And I think the idea is at the very core of who you are, do not give in to fear. Be courageous. And the second thing I want you to know is there are really two parts to this verse. Do you see how it's structured? Wait for the Lord. Be strong, take heart, be courageous. And then back to the first theme, wait for the Lord. So there's a challenge that you are to be strong. You're not to give in to fear. But that challenge is given within the context of waiting on the Lord. Now realize, initially it may feel like, I don't know how these two things go together, right? They seem to be two very different themes. Wait, be courageous. So how do these themes go together? How does the call to be strong fit with the call to wait and hope? Well, I like to think of it this way. If I would put them together, I would put them together with this phrase. It's a call to active dependence. Okay? It's a call to active dependence. And I think it's really important to see that these two themes are being brought together. Because if we're honest, I think for many of us, we would acknowledge that just naturally we gravitate to one theme rather than the other, right? I think for some of us in hard situations, difficult, complicated situations, maybe we kind of gravitate to the wait side. Well, I'm just going to wait and see what God does with this. But sometimes in our claim to be waiting, there's an action step that we are failing to take. Sometimes under the banner of waiting for God, we're avoiding things we need to do. And understand, I don't think the waiting is mere passivity. After all, remember the broader context. The broader context is you're in a battle. It's warfare. And so we have to be careful because sometimes our commitment to waiting on God becomes an excuse for hiding, avoiding passivity. Here, the theme of waiting is coupled with be strong, be courageous. Having said that, I think some of us in complicated situations, we kind of gravitate to the strong and courageous side. That is, when things get tough, what I want to do is I want to take control. I want to manage the situation, right? And sometimes that means I want to manage other people and how they're responding. And so for some of us, we just, in the midst of those ups and down situations, we just kind of gravitate to the be strong and the be courageous side. And we lose sight of the fact that the idea of being strong and being courageous doesn't mean you're in absolute control. Rather, it's to take place within the context of waiting for God. So I just encourage you to just think about this for a moment. Maybe if you're having lunch with friends or family who've been here today, here's a great lunchtime question. Do you gravitate to one side or the other? Do you naturally just kind of gravitate to the waiting part, or do you naturally gravitate to the be strong, be courageous part? But David is saying these two things need to go together. So just think about them very briefly. First, there's that theme of waiting. You know, we've just gone through the Christmas season. Along the way, we looked at Luke chapter 2, and right, the famous narrative of the Christmas story. But as you continue reading in Luke 2, Luke describes the day when Jesus' parents brought him to the temple a few days after he was born. There, Luke highlights the interactions that they have with two people, right? An older man by the name of Simeon, an older woman by the name of Anna. And in the midst of that busyness of hundreds of people going in and out of the temple, both of these individuals recognize the baby as the coming Messiah. Now think about that for a moment, and just remember the broader context. The broader context is, by this time, for several centuries, Israel has been under foreign domination. And that insult is complicated by the fact that even the Jewish king, Herod the Great, seems to be more concerned about impressing the Romans than being faithful to the Jewish faith. So it's kind of a season where it feels like all the leadership at that level has turned against you. And arguably it was a season where it could just be natural and comfortable just to say, okay, we'll go through the religious rituals and religious activities, but we've got to make life work on our own. And yet, even despite that broader context, here are these two people just faithfully pursuing God day after day, week after week, month after month, praying, imploring God to fulfill his promises. And finally, that day comes. And an interesting question is, why do you think Luke includes these two people? Well, I guess, on the one hand, it's a supernatural confirmation of who Jesus is. That's true. It was a confirmation to his parents of who he was. That's true. But in some ways, he could have included another miracle that might have had more punch for us in impressing us with who Jesus was. And yet he includes this story. These two older people. And really the defining element in their stories was simply they've been waiting for God. Day after day, week after week, month after month. And maybe there's something Luke wants us to see about that posture of worship, of trust, of commitment. But even as we wait, we must also be strong. Remember, it's active dependence. As I said, I think the language used here for being strong and courageous communicates the idea of not giving in to fear. So let me ask you, and let me just ask you to do some self-diagnosis for a moment. When you are fearful, when life gets complicated, do you respond in unhealthy ways? Maybe I fight back, I go on the attack, I try to control, right? I try to overcome my fear by controlling people or situations. Maybe that will include over time blaming others, arguing to win, micromanaging. Maybe I withdraw, right? I escape discomfort rather than facing it. I withdraw emotionally. I procrastinate or I quit too quickly. I shut down hard conversations by changing the subject. I avoid with conflict altogether with other people. Or maybe I just freeze. I become paralyzed by fear. I feel stuck, numb, unable to make a decision. Maybe I just live in a state of indecision on certain issues. Just understand, these are some unhealthy ways we can respond to fear. But remember what David is saying. Look, in the context of waiting for God, in the context of pursuing him, understanding who he is and how he is at work, let that reality give you strength. That's the active part of dependence. In light of who he is, I trust him. And if I believe he is who he says he is, here are the steps I'm going to take. I acknowledged a few moments ago, I think this next year, whatever it looks like, it's going to come with ups and downs. It's going to come with those moments that provide joy, but also those situations with complexity. Some of you are going to find yourself in one of those complicated situations, a major decision, a difficult relationship, a new job, some other type of challenge. And what I want to challenge you to do is, if you find yourself in one of these complicated situations, I just want to encourage you, take a 3x5 card, take a half sheet of paper, and just write the words active dependence across the top. And maybe just come back to this verse, right? Wait on the Lord, be strong, be courageous, wait on the Lord. And just kind of prayerfully consider, okay, what does active dependence look like in this situation? First of all, think about the dependence. How do I depend on God in this situation? And just wrestle with, here's how I'm going to pray about this situation and be consistent in prayer. I think part of being dependent on God is also kind of bringing other people into this with you, right? To pray with you. And I know sometimes that's hard because in some of these hard situations, it feels embarrassing to talk to other people about it, right? I'm going through this job change and I haven't figured out what it looks like and I feel vulnerable talking to other people. But I think part of depending on God is inviting others who know you, who care about you, to kind of be in this with you and to pray with you. But even as you think about what does it look like to depend on God, then what does it look like to be active in that dependence? What are the steps I need to take in engaging this well? And maybe some of that is what's the negative thinking that I need to confront? I didn't know about you, but I remember kind of going through this long transition after I finished my education and looking for my first pastoral position. One of the things that frustrated me endlessly was you'd contact churches about jobs and you just never hear from them. And maybe you've had that experience. You're going through a job transition and you get ghosted by a potential employer, and it just, all these negative thoughts just keep going through your mind. And part of being active in handling that situation is confronting certain patterns of thinking. So be intentional in taking this verse seriously. Here's what it looks like for me to be dependent on you, God, in this situation. And in light of that dependence, here are the steps I need to take. So as we end 2025 and begin 2026, I think David invites us to a life of active dependence. Wait on the Lord. Be strong. Take heart. Be courageous. Wait on the Lord. I encourage you to pay attention to this verse, to grab hold of the themes of this verse, because at some point in 2026, you will need it. Let's pray. Gracious God, we come to this time of year where we're about to turn the page on the calendar, and even as we reflect on 2025 and look forward to 2026, we've had the opportunity to talk about some things in our lives that have been encouraging, highlights for us. But even as we do that, we also know that moving into the new year, there are going to be ups and downs. There are going to be situations that are stressful or complicated. And Father, some of us already know what those are because we're in the midst of them. We're dealing with health issues. We're dealing with complexities at work. We're in a season of transition and we're not quite sure what the next step looks like. We're dealing with stress points in a key relationship in our lives and not quite sure what the next step holds. And Father, even if we're not going through those kinds of situations now, I'm sure at some point in 2026, we're going to experience those things that can be stress-inducing, places where we can get stuck in fear. So I pray in those moments you would bring this verse to mind, this encouragement from King David, who, having experienced all kinds of conflict and complexity, speaks to his own heart and he speaks to ours. Wait on the Lord. Be strong. Be courageous. Wait on the Lord. May we take that to heart in 2026. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, I want to thank you for joining us as we wrap up 2025. We're going to start a new series next Sunday looking at the Gospel of John, so I hope you can join us for that. As you go, members of our prayer team are going to be here at the front, and if we can pray with you, maybe even about one of those pressure points in your life right now, we would love the opportunity to do so. Now, as you go, I wish you a happy new year, and I pray that you can enter this new year as someone who waits on the Lord, but does so as a person who is strong and courageous. Amen.